Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman Podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by Organifi. You know, the one thing that literally every single diet and nutrition expert that we've had on the show seems to agree on is that we need to eat more veg and get our greens and consume all natural products. But let's be honest. How many of us actually have the time? Well, recently I had the opportunity to meet some of the folks over at Organifi, and I've been absolutely blown away by them and their product. You see, Organifi is an organic superfood green juice powder that literally covers all your nutritional bases without having to eat 5 bowls of kale. It saves you loads of time, loads of money, and a lot of chewing. And really all you have to do is add water and drink it. So to check it out and save an incredible 20% off your first order, visit Organifi.com. That's Organifi.com and use coupon code Superhuman at checkout. Before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that this week's episode is brought to you by my new online course, Become a Superhuman. And yes, it sounds exactly like the title of the podcast, but this is actually an online course where we go into the various aspects of improving your health, specifically your endocrine health. More specifically, getting your testosterone up to the optimal levels. Now, whether you're a male or a female, as we've learned in numerous episodes of the show, testosterone is the ultimate feel-good motivation, improved health, improved fitness, improved body composition, super drug. Okay, so everything from your mood to your recovery time and everything in between is affected by your body's endocrine health. And what my team and I have done is we've actually taken years of my own self-experimentation, years of research, every possible literature and study we could find, and we've condensed it into a simple 3 to 4 hour program that you can follow along and make simple, safe, and easy adjustments to your lifestyle to improve your endocrine health. Now, as listeners of this podcast, you can get a very special discount by visiting jle.vi/T. That's jle.vi, just like my name, /T for testosterone. Greetings, super friends, and welcome to the Becoming Superhuman Podcast. You guys, before we get started, I want to read you an awesome review from BKitchen07 from the United States of America, who says, "The one-stop shop to become superhuman." Jonathan Levy does an excellent job of delivering top-notch content from many of the leading experts that are alive today. He's been able to find the leaders in many different areas, ranging from fitness, nutrition, learning, entrepreneurship, and much more. This podcast is your one-stop shop for everything a person needs to take their life to the next level. I also take his Super Learner course, which is also very effective and entertaining. This podcast has become a staple in my weekly podcast arsenal, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Keep it up. Thank you so much for that review. Absolutely incredible. And if you have not yet left a review, yes, you listening out there, take a moment. I would really appreciate it. On to today's episode, you guys. Today we have a very, very special treat as we are inviting back one of my favorite thought leaders and podcasters and authors for a second time on the show. The guest is Robb Wolf, and he is a New York Times bestselling author of The Paleo Solution, one of my favorite books, and host of the Paleo Solution Podcast, which is one of my favorite podcasts. You're probably picking up on a theme here. I really, really like Robb's work. He is widely regarded, by the way, as one of the top authorities in the world of diet and nutrition. He also dabbles in jiu-jitsu and is a former powerlifting champion. I don't know if you guys knew that. Robb joins us today to talk about his latest and much anticipated book, Wired to Eat. Turn off cravings, rewire your appetite for weight loss, and determine the foods that work for you. You guys, I have to say that I so enjoyed Robb's first book that I honestly almost broke my rule about not reading the book in advance so that I can ask kind of more beginnery questions and don't get into the high level stuff that someone who hasn't read the book wouldn't understand. But I held out. I have my copy here. I haven't even cracked the spine yet. And I did it just for you guys. So in this episode, guys, we're going to talk about a lot of different topics. We're going to talk about understanding the variance between people, where that variance comes from. We're going to get into a practical framework for diagnosing what works for you. We're going to talk about blood glucose monitoring, how much carbohydrate is too much, fasting, ketosis. Really, we go very deep into the nitty-gritty. And at the same time, once again, when I got to the interview, I felt like I'd really only scratched the surface of Robb's tremendous knowledge. And, as he said, he's been doing this for 20 years. So he has so much to share. And I really understood at the end of the interview why he had to write this book and why it's going to provide so much unique value for people. Because ultimately, what he's talking about today is how to help you understand for yourself what you need, what is going to work well for your body without having to go to a professional or guess it or use a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think, guys, that's something that has been so sorely missing, is giving each and every one of us that toolkit, that framework to assess and then reassess as our bodies grow, change, mature, and develop. So as you can tell, I'm very excited about this book. I'm very excited about this guest. So without any further ado, guys, let me present to you my friend, Mr. Robb Wolf. Mr. Robb Wolf, welcome back, my friend. It's so good to talk to you.
Hey, man, huge honor. Always glad to bring down property values anywhere that folks will let me do it. So thank you.
Amazing. Robb, how's it been going, man? What have you been up to, recently? I know I was just on your show. We didn't get a chance to talk about what you've been doing and what you've been up to for the last, 6 years since releasing the book.
So we had a couple of kids, so that was interesting. Mixed into a little time intensive. Yeah, as the label claims will state, you actually have to put some time and effort into that. My wife and I moved to Reno, Nevada about 5 years ago. And I got hooked up with a medical clinic here that had just done a pilot study with the Reno Police, Reno Fire Department. They found about 40 folks that were at high risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, put these folks on a paleo diet, modified their sleep and exercise as best they could. And based off the changes in their blood work and health risk assessment parameters, it's estimated that program saved the city of Reno about $22 million with a 33-to-1 return on investment. And wow. I managed to kind of wiggle my way into this clinic. I'm now on the board of directors, and I've been working on a process to try to scale this whole thing and take it out to the masses. And then the last year, I've been working on a book called Wired to Eat, which is hopefully looking pretty deep at the neuroregulation of appetite and a very different perspective on eating food, overeating than the first book, the Paleo Solution. I touched a little bit on the neuroregulation of appetite in the first book, but this one, it really goes pretty deep on that, trying to set a different kind of tone for why it's so difficult to navigate the modern world. And that's basically the last 6 years of my life in a very abbreviated fashion.
Amazing. And I have a copy of Wired to Eat here. I'm so excited to read it. I have to admit, I almost broke my no reading the book before the interview rule because it showed up and I was just so excited. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I definitely sense this dissonance. As you know, I'm a huge fan of your show, and I've listened to you talk on the show in recent episodes, and I've read Paleo Solution, and I've definitely sensed that you have so much more knowledge to give and such a higher level that goes way beyond just the what goes in the mouth, but also what happens after the mouth. So tell us a little bit about why you needed to revisit the topic and, what's in this book that wasn't in the prior one.
Oh, man, it's really funny, and this shows really what an absolute idiot and how naive I am, because when I finished the Paleo Solution, I was like, okay, so I don't know what I'm going to do now. Like, this book's going to change the world. And like, I need my next career. Like, I'm going to go farm coconuts and like, everything's going to be solved. And it was really quite successful. It definitely has helped a lot of people, but not everybody bought into the paleo shtick. And even the people who did buy into it and gave it a shot. A lot of them turned these simple guidelines that were supposed to be an orienting process. They turned it into like religious doctrine, and they spent an enormous amount of time just, asking, is this paleo, versus asking the question, is this actually good for me? And so, there were lots of wacky things. And then also, like, each year you have the U.S. News and World Reports that, calls paleo or Whole30, the paleo-esque stuff, the worst possible diet approaches that you could imagine. And so there's this kind of image and PR challenge, which in some ways is kind of good. Like CrossFit learned that there really was no bad, PR or media exposure. And so it's kind of good on the one hand, but also it's just kind of annoying to be in that fight all the time. And also I just started looking at, there are some people that if you throw out this idea of give stuff a shot for 30 days, see how you look, feel, and perform, and then, let's circle back and tinker with things from there. A lot of people will buy into that, but there's a remarkably large slice of the population that for whatever reason, they just can't get going, or even if they get going, there's some like self-sabotage that goes on. And it usually involves this sense of guilt and failure and gee whiz, why is this so hard? And I was noodling on this a lot. And, people would tell me, I don't know why, I feel guilty. This stuff is hard. This change is hard. And I would look at them. I'm like, well, of course it's hard. Like, you're wired for a life way that's totally different than the way it is today. And you would be nuts to think that it shouldn't be hard to avoid like the snack aisle of the supermarket. And, it kind of rocked me back on my heels. And then I tracked down a paper completely by accident that was looking, partial title was The Omnivore's Real Dilemma, Brain Development and the Determinants of, Human Evolution. And it was a fascinating paper. And it really laid out this case that, the neuroregulation of appetite, which is, governed by a couple of different processes. On the one hand, it's this thing, optimum foraging strategy, which is basically any critter on the planet that moves, it tries to figure out how to get the most energy, the most nutrition, expending the least amount of effort. And it's just basic economics and thermodynamics kind of wed together. If you have to run around and burn more energy than what you can obtain out of your environment, you're going to die at some point, And so we're, hardwired into our genetics is this idea of optimum foraging strategy. But then there's kind of a dueling banjo on the other side of this thing called palate fatigue. And we basically are wired up to get bored of anything that we're eating once we get a decent exposure to it. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that we're wanting to get as wide a variety of nutrition as we can. And then the second is that most of the plant-based material that we've encountered in the past, and even currently, it has a certain degree of toxicity to it. And so, there's this back and forth where you want variety, but you don't want to get too much of something. And these concepts of optimum foraging strategy and the palate fatigue really drive us now when we live in this environment of hyperpalatable foods and infinite food variety. We're really, really set up to overeat. And there's been, decades of these macronutrient wars where people will say, well, it's high carb, low fat, or high fat, low carb. And we find examples where those things both work and fail. But the real crux of things is just the fact that folks overeat, and that is all governed by the neuroregulation of appetite. And there's some really deeply ingrained evolutionary forces that drive that whole process. And our whole world is set up to, skew us down the snack aisle of the supermarket. And so this thing was really an effort to liberate people from that sense of guilt and failure, that this stuff is hard. And then hopefully once we get past that emotional piece, then we can actually affect some change and get going in a favorable direction.
Incredible. So is it mostly about weight loss, or is it really kind of geared towards anyone in the way the Paleo Solution was?
It really is geared towards anyone. And that was something that made my publisher crazy, because they wanted like a 7 days to paleo abs kind of deal. And I'm just not good at that stuff. Like, if I have a failing, it's this not being able to delineate things in a kind of like outline stepwise fashion. But if I have a strength, then it's actually being able to provide some synthesis. So this thing spans everything from autoimmune conditions, gut health, neurodegenerative disease, optimum performance, ketogenic diets. So, I mean, it's really a huge rangy book. It ends up being almost 400 pages, I think, between, the actual substantive writing and then references and recipes and meal plans and all that stuff. So it really does span a lot of territory, but it, if you're like an elite level CrossFit Games competitor, I don't know that you're going to get an enormous amount out of the book, but if you coach people, it would be incredibly valuable for someone like that. But short of someone just being like an uber competitive athlete and they're trying to figure out like, should I spend money here or there, to try to optimize their performance. If you're just 100% performance optimization oriented, then this book may not be the best one. But if you do coaching, or if you've got more of a general health and longevity kind of focus, then I think that there's an enormous amount to be had here.
Incredible. And I see that, the first part of the book is broken down into Know Thyself, and the second one is really a program. Looks like a 3-phase program. Tell me a little bit about that. I'm just kind of curious around like how long does it take and basically where does it go? Because one of the things I loved about the Paleo Solution is you're like, dude, just do exactly this for 30 days. And if it doesn't work, like toss the book aside. But if it does, so I really like that you make the challenge very clear for people. And it seems like you've done that again with this 3-phase process. Tell me a bit about that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And, all of that was just born out of running a gym and helping to manage a medical clinic. So, I mean, there's some pretty good, real life experience that kind of informs that process. But once folks get done with the why part of the book, how you're wired to eat and why this is a challenge, sleep, photo period, gut health, all this stuff, kind of understanding everything that goes into managing our neuroregulation of appetite, then we go through an assessment process trying to figure out where you are on kind of the metabolic health kind of parameters and really looking at insulin resistance. And we have some measures, both subjective and objective, trying to figure out where you are on the insulin resistance spectrum. Then we roll out a 30-day reset that is largely kind of oriented towards paleo type foods, probably a little bit on the lower carb side for most folks, although there are folks that have weight issues that are not insulin resistant. And those people, I have kind of a different track for them. But I mean, it's actually a pretty small percentage of the population that really applies to. But we use this 30-day reset to reduce inflammation, to reduce insulin resistance, and really to help repair the neuroregulation of appetite. The name of the game, because we don't all live in a metabolic ward or prison, fortunately, like we're free-ranging humans and we can make all kinds of different choices. And so we, you have to figure out some strategy for how to navigate the modern world. And some of that is, cleaning out the house, recognizing what trigger foods may set you off on kind of a hookers and cocaine binge. Like for me, I could really take or leave sweets. I like dark chocolate, okay, but it's not that big of a deal. But you get me like some sea salt and vinegar, potato chips or something like that, I will eat all of them. So my big deal is salty, savory stuff. And I could really take or leave sweets, but that's part of the process. You have to figure out what those potential trigger foods are for you and figure out if you can moderate that intake or if you need to abstain largely from that intake in order to be successful. But after about 30 days of doing that, we should be in a pretty good spot to then circle back and start testing how we respond to carbohydrates in general, but some carbohydrates that are outside the classic like paleo format. And what I recommend in the book, although you don't have to do this, you can run all this in a subjective fashion. And by subjective, that means you eat a meal and then 2 hours later, how do you feel? How's your cognition? I have a pretty long list of subjective measures, but I do also recommend that folks track down an inexpensive blood glucose meter and they just check things. They do a prescribed amount of carbohydrate. They check that at either an hour or 2 hours post meal. And we kind of map how folks respond to different meals and different carbohydrate sources. And this is based off some recent work that came out of Israel, actually, that looks at personalized nutrition. And it was really fascinating in that there was no concrete uniform response to the foods that folks ate, like things that we would historically think would cause a very modest blood glucose increase. In some people, it shot it up really high. Other things like white rice or potatoes, in certain people, it barely makes the blood glucose go up. Whereas in me, a modest amount of those foods makes my blood sugars nearly in the diabetic range. And so it kind of answers some of this question where, we see huge variation from person to person and how they respond to different foods. And so I'm helping folks to kind of move down that path. So they use the 30-day reset to kind of get reoriented, reduce inflammation, reduce insulin resistance. Then they use a 7-day carb test to try to figure out some latitude so that we're not just stuck in paleo land like the rest of our lives, but we're doing it in a really quantifiable, concrete way so that we know what types of foods we may react favorably or poorly to. And then the third phase is largely what I call riding into the sunset. And that is taking all these tools that we have and then making that work over the long haul. And part of what many people need to do for that long haul piece is to actually revisit the 30-day reset and the 7-day carb test at various points. And I recommend it maybe quarterly, that you look at how you're doing and then critically assess, do I need to tighten things up again? Is my eating kind of poor? Am I gaining weight? Is my sleep disturbed? And then you can re-implement the 7-day carb test or the 30-day reset as needed so that you can kind of pull things back on track.
Wow. Okay. So a lot to unpack there. I like the systematization of it. I like just seeing the evolution of your approach and how it's matured over the years. And I also like that I think this is an experience that so many people have where my cravings tend to change and alter, and there is this kind of ongoing maintenance component that I really love. I mean, when I reached out to you for this interview, I was going through the weirdest sweet cravings. And I'm like you, I'm all about the salty, starchy. I mean, put potatoes in front of me and I'll just never stop eating. But then there was like this weird 3 or 4 week period where I was just craving sweet all the time. And so I was really excited to kind of get my hands on this book and be like, what is going on?
Yeah. And, the variability from day to day, week to week is really interesting. And, we have genetic factors, we have epigenetic factors like our gut microbiome, sleep, stress levels, all those things can play into it. And so this is, again, part of why the book is so huge, because if you leave one of those pieces out, like if you don't really address sleep and circadian rhythm in a qualitative fashion, then it's going to be a huge blind spot. Like people who are shift workers, or they're like super into the technology scene and they're staying up till like 2:00 in the morning and they're like, oh, I'm eating better, but I still feel bad. And it's like, I'm insulin resistant. And so you really do need a comprehensive approach to this stuff to fully get your hands on it. And again, my goal isn't to turn everybody into, carbon copies of one another, but to give them the information so that they can do a risk assessment and just say, well, what am I willing to give up in order to get this? And then you can make a critical assessment on that. And some people will go through this whole process and they look great and they feel great. And they're just like, I enjoyed it when I didn't work out and I ate like crap and I just liked it better. It doesn't happen that often, but occasionally, and that's fine. My main goal has just been to mainly help the folks that are sick to understand that there is an option that is oftentimes not kicked around within the mainstream medical environment. And that's really my passion and my goal.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, is like, what's our job as content creators and how much guilt should we take on if people consume the content, or even worse, pick up a copy of the book and never read it, or read it and never act on it. And what I've come to the conclusion is you just can't beat yourself up about it. 27% of books that are bought are actually read, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah.
I do want to jump back on the research you talked about, and I appreciate the shout out for Israel there, on kind of variability between individuals, because one of my big takeaways, and I actually summarized this in our 100 episode summary of like what were my biggest takeaways, the biggest, most surprising thing I took away from your interview was exactly that I had been one of those people who turned it to religion, like, is this paleo or not? And I found you to be completely on the other side of the spectrum of like, well, do what works for you and try and test. And I think it's super interesting that in this book, it's actually made it right into the title, right? So the last sentence of the title is that works for you, like finding the foods that work for you. Why is that? I mean, what experiences have you had where certain populations react differently to certain foods? Kind of break it down for us. What has caused you to come out much more in favor of this customization approach?
Oh, man, it's a really good question. And this is where I get to air some dirty laundry on my ignorance and past failures. So I came at this stuff as someone who had significant health problems. I had insulin resistance, had all kinds of GI problems. And this kind of low carb paleo shtick just was magic for me. It literally saved my life. And you cannot have a process for creating religious zealot converts that is more effective than like a life-saving experience. So, that was my experience. And then I started putting this message out there, and I had a similar, fortunately, it's very cool. Like for very, very many people, they had similar experiences. And so you just get this kind of religious zealotry around this material. And I was like, man, low carb is it, and paleo is it. And then in the process of running a CrossFit style gym, this approach worked phenomenally for folks that were really overweight. And this low carb kind of quasi ketogenic diet ended up destroying folks that were lean and hard charging athletes. And I would just kind of scratch my head and I'm like, well, if you just tried harder, it would work, and all this really, I was trying to shoehorn reality to fit my biases and not the other way around, taking the feedback that reality was providing me and modifying what my perspective was. And so it took a couple of years and beating myself up and breaking a few athletes that I worked with to finally come back around and say, so in an insulin resistant overweight population, this low carb thing is really good. And then in a more lean, athletic, insulin sensitive population, these carbs are pretty valuable, and we need to keep the quality good, ideally, and all that type of stuff. But, it's different situations to necessitate different tools. And it's funny, if you listen to like some contractors, nobody is in a pissing match about whether you should use a bandsaw or a screwdriver for a particular situation. It's like the right tool for the right job. But in this nutrition environment and medicine also, it's incredibly opinion based, and it's kind of remarkable. And as we motor forward and we get some of this quantified self stuff figured out, then we're getting more data about what the appropriate tool is. But the realization that there's a massive need for customization was painful and slow in coming to me, and I broke a lot of people, and so that's throwing myself under the bus and being honest about that. But then there is another side, which I'll try to exonerate myself and other folks in this regard, which is... I was
going to say, you're being really hard on yourself, but go on.
But I think that that's valuable, important. But there is another side to this, which is when people really don't know how to eat well, like what does that mean? Then you need some really simple guidelines. Like you just... I don't know if you ever go bowling. We do it every once in a while, but when the kids bowl, there's like these bumpers that come up so the ball can't go in the gutter. And so you have to give folks some guidelines such that it's impossible for them to go off the road, or they need to really, really try to go off the road. And those super simple guidelines like low carb, is even more accessible than paleo, because paleo starts becoming this nebulous thing. It's like, okay, so legumes are bad, but green beans are okay, but green beans are a legume. It starts getting very complex rather quickly. And so that's where like high carb or low carb are really simple and accessible. And folks oftentimes get a lot of success with that, at least initially. And so again, there's this dueling banjo, or the dynamic tension between starting folks with a simple enough approach so that they've got an opportunity for success and they're not going to be buried under the details. But then in the background of that, not allowing these simple rules to get turned into religious doctrine that then you can't explore outside of that basic parameter. And it's a challenge going back and forth with that. And so I both made mistakes in the way that I originally rolled this out. And some of the way that I rolled it out was in response to folks saying, hey, this is really complex. Just give me some super simple guidelines and then I can follow that. And both of those things are truths and they're realities, and it changes based off the situation. And you need to be flexible in how you roll out that information.
I like it. So what I'm understanding is actually a lot of the variability has less to do. Because at one point we talked about, if you're from this part of the world or your ancestors are this part of the world, you may do better with this. It's more about, look, if your body weight is this and you're this much overweight and you're insulin resistant, these foods may work. Whereas it kind of has more to do with body composition and insulin response than it does with, say, I guess microbiome is also a huge part of that, but more than it does to say with genetic makeup.
You know what? Again, both of those stories are true. And let's say you have someone who, based on genetics and epigenetics and the way the environment has influenced that individual, a lower carb approach may be appropriate. But once they fix the gut microbiome with that lower carb approach, they may hit a point where, based on their genetics and their new gut microbiome status, they may need to really ratchet the carbs up and potentially the fat down to really hit their optimum, the way that they are going to function the best. Whereas someone like me, Northern European and Neanderthal, basically for, a genetic lineage, I had some really dodgy early life gut issues, vaginal birth, but not breastfed, lots of antibiotics early on. You kind of march this thing forward. And I have some pretty good gut issues still. And I have to really keep things rather tight to manage both that and my blood sugar responses. And so for me, I really need to stay on that lower carb side of things for the most part, but somebody else might have some latitude there. But we both use the same intervention in the beginning, but then based off of individual differences, which are genetic and epigenetic driven, then we may modify down the road. So it's kind of cool in that if we just keep things rather simple and just address what the current situation is, insulin resistance or sleep deprivation or what have you, then, using these 4 pillars, sleep, food, exercise, and community piece being the folks that we're connected to, but then also the microbiome that makes up our internal and external world. If we address all those issues, we kind of in a macro way will largely deal with what we need to, but there will be little nuances based off of individual needs.
I like it. And as you speak, I'm really starting to understand why this book was so critical and also why it's a 400-page manual, because I'm dying to ask specific questions, but they're going to end up being specific questions that are relevant only to me. And it really sounds like the gold here and the real value of this book is in understanding what's been missing, that framework to scientifically go about and test these things and get, Robb Wolf level coaching that will help me understand what works exactly, as opposed to the one size fits all.
That's the goal. And we'll see how effective I am on that. And, it's interesting also that these pretty strong black or white recommendations they are very appealing and folks can get a lot of success with that. So this more nuanced approach, we'll see it. It could be helpful. It could be a hit, or it may be peeing in the wind. We'll kind of see how that gets received.
I like it. I try to avoid getting into the personal, but of course I'm going to ask a good personal one, which is last time we spoke, you kind of gave me permission to eat hummus, which was magical and wonderful. Now you're talking about in lean populations, there may be this necessity to kind of scale the carbs back up. Does that mean I get to eat French fries, or what kind of carbohydrates are we talking about here?
And that's another interesting thing. And it's really all over the map. So part of the study, this personalized nutrition study, hummus was actually a really interesting one, because about 50% of people had what you would expect to be a very modest blood glucose increase due to the hummus. And other people had a massive blood glucose response, which was clearly there's not a lot of carbs there. So some of what's going on is there's some sort of an immunogenic reaction that is causing people a stress response. And, this is probably issues with wheat and dairy. There's a lot of different foods that can cause this immunogenic response that is really disproportionate to the carbohydrate intake or, carbohydrate content. So, it's interesting. I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor for the past 2 weeks and trying to map as many different foods and combinations and situations as I can. And starchy foods, I don't do particularly well with, even at pretty small levels. And Chris Masterjohn he's been doing these little short videos that are just amazing. Everything he's doing is really phenomenal. But he mentions that folks who have a limited number of the amylase gene, which amylase is the enzyme that helps us break down starch. We have it both at the pancreas level and also in the salivary release. But folks who have high amounts of salivary amylase, when they eat starch, that starch gets broken down into some sugars rather easily, and they perceive things like potatoes or pasta in kind of a sweet fashion. And that taste of sweetness actually enhances the first phase insulin response that starts kind of anticipation of this sweet or carbohydrate-rich meal getting into our system, and it helps us to deal with that. And without that sweet taste, you rely on the second phase insulin response, which is kind of a blunt instrument, and it's part of what can kind of lead to really elevated blood glucose levels and exceptionally high insulin levels and trying to deal with that. And so he made the recommendation that some people may need to add a little bit of simple sugars into a meal right at the beginning because that sweet taste will help to prime the pump on that first phase insulin response. And it's really interesting. I've tried rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and I do what would be effective 50 grams of carbs of those substances mixed into a meal. And I've tried them both individually and mixed into a meal. And I just get huge blood glucose responses. But last night I tried 50 grams of carbohydrate from ice cream, and I literally, my blood glucose barely budged.
Wow.
I mean, it was already in the 70s, and it maybe went from 75 to 78, which is a small enough variation that you don't even know if that's error within the, the testing medium. It was a smaller variation than what the error is in reading. And there's some nuance to that. Sugar in ice cream comes in lactose and sucrose. Both of those are disaccharides that go to the liver, get split. And in the case of sucrose, the fructose part of that preferentially fills liver glycogen. Then the glucose part is available to either be released or stored as liver glycogen. And then with the lactose, it's essentially two pieces of glucose. And when you get right down to it, and so both of those could either be stored or released. But it's a speed bump process for those sugars to make it out and be read as blood glucose. So I don't, is the argument, eat, ice cream every day? I'm not sure, because topping off liver glycogen is a really, really good way to get metabolic derangement, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and some other nasty things. That's a great way to get that stuff kicked off. But it's fascinating that I felt way better eating the ice cream. I had some Ciappino and then the ice cream. And I felt way better after that meal than I did a meal of white rice or potatoes or sweet potatoes, that offered the same amount of effective carbs. And I also had a similar amount of protein and fat with those other meals. So just subjectively, I felt better. I didn't have that irritated feeling, the blurry vision and all that comes with high blood glucose levels. And on the objective level, clearly my blood glucose was much, much better. So is that a net win? It might be. I don't know.
Now, just to be clear, because I've also been really interested in doing the blood testing, and I've also there are so many things that you talk about on your show that I'm like, yeah, I should probably weigh and measure for a week and see what happens. With the blood glucose testing, is there kind of a rough number, you're trying to keep your blood sugar under 100, or does it vary for everyone? What's the thinking on that if people do want to actually go ahead and do that testing?
So, in the book, I make a recommendation of finding amounts and types of carbohydrates that doesn't move the blood sugar much above 115. And I apologize because I know I'm using archaic US units, and I do in the book, I believe, have the international units in there also. But I based this in part on the following observation, and it was that some hunter-gatherers quite a number of them were given an oral glucose tolerance test. And this is where these individuals consume 100 grams of glucose, and then the blood sugar is tracked over time. And with these folks, rarely did their blood glucose go above 90 to about 110, 115. And normally, someone who takes an oral glucose tolerance test, so long as you stay under 200, they feel like you're doing pretty good. Wow. And so I make this point again and again in the book that a lot of the lab values that we look at are considering an overall unhealthy, sick population, but that's the norm. That's the bulk of the people coming through the door. And so, the norm gets ascribed as being something that's laudable or that we want to shoot for. But I really think that this is some of the area that we can learn a lot from these pre-agricultural, non-Westernized societies. And so I kind of used this benchmark of what's the outer range of a super metabolically fit hunter-gatherer who is given a massive bolus of glucose, and what's the kind of variation in their blood sugar. And it wasn't much.
Wow.
So that's kind of what I hang my hat on. And it's fascinating that, in tinkering with this stuff, I've found that, fruit, I tend to have a better blood glucose response in general with even things like ripe bananas and stuff like that relative to outright starch. And my wife, by contrast, has almost the opposite of kind of response. And she's smaller than I am, but she can eat a larger portion of rice or white potatoes and have a much lower blood glucose response than what I do. And, we've just kind of noticed this empirically where we'll go have some Mexican food and I might have some tortillas and maybe some beans or something. And afterwards, I feel like I'm just going to fall asleep. I'm totally in that pending carb coma. And I will ask her, how are you feeling? And she's like, oh, fine. I might have just a little bit of carb head, but not bad. And then within an hour, she is 100% okay. And I'm still feeling like crap like a day later from that really big carb meal. So if you pay attention to this stuff, you do, even on just a very empirical level, you usually get some indications of how you are actually handling this stuff. But the blood glucose monitoring really gives you some hard data to hang your hat on with that.
Yeah, I think I want to try that out for sure. Although I do want to mention, you've now mentioned Mexican food, and we talked about, you had a birthday recently and you talked about chocolate mousse before we hopped on the recording. So I'm not trying to call you out, but I am trying to ask you a controversial question, which is, where does cheating fit in? I mean, if we're trying to eliminate cravings, but at the same time, you have become so much more moderate and so much more practical in your application. So what's the deal with cheating?
Man, a really good question. And I devote a whole chapter to the cheating topic. And one of the things that I saw really derail people again and again and again was this idea of, okay, well, when can I do my cheat meal and what's involved with that? And it's just been something that's irritated me about this forever. And I couldn't really put my finger on exactly what it was that was bothersome with this. But I actually got in and looked at the etymology of the word cheat. And what it means is to take unfair advantage of someone. So it's kind of like, okay. And again, if you dig into the evolutionary biology stuff, morality and guilt and sense of justice and fairness is something that's in all primates. Like it's conserved throughout all primates. If one primate in a group is being victimized at the expense of someone else, then there's oftentimes some really powerful, like kind of social repercussions with that. And so this is something that is woven into all primates, this sense of justice and also guilt because of cheating or, mishandling someone. So it's a really powerful thing. But with food, so let's say you're supposed to be eating paleo or vegan or, what have you. And then you're like, oh, man, I'm going to eat this thing. And I cheated on my diet. Like that's kind of the terminology that's used. To cheat, you need to gain an unfair advantage on someone. Who did you gain an unfair advantage on? No one. Like, you can eat food. There's consequences to that food, metabolically and potentially, psychologically, because you're like, wow, I really like that. And now I want to eat more and more and more of it. But there's no moral attachment to it. I mean, there just is not. So the cheating thing really makes me kind of crazy because it's just using the wrong terminology. But what people end up doing they associate the moral guilt with cheating, even though they didn't damage or harm anyone. So I relate some stories in that chapter about some folks that I've worked with. And, oftentimes some of these impulses around the cheating or, the focusing on food as kind of a moral behavior, they usually have some other thing in their past, usually related to love or power or connection, that is the driver. And they really focus on food as kind of the thing that they need to pay attention to. And they'll say things like, I need to have a healthy relationship with food. And I just think that's bollocks. Like, if the people that I hear saying I need a healthy relationship with food, they probably have something going on, but it's got nothing to do with the food. The food, though, becomes a distraction that will guarantee that they never get to the root cause of what they're dealing with. And this idea of cheating and like the healthy relationship with food are two kind of interrelated concepts that I see really derail people constantly. So, if you want to have something, have it. Just understand that there may be consequences to it. Like, you may not feel great. If I just don't have any type of gluten containing item ever, because the gut issues I have from that, it hurts. I kind of have neurological stuff. Like, it is just not worthwhile, relative to the ability to say, like, have some gluten-free pizza or something like that. Like, it's just not comparable. So I really dig into that whole, what is cheating and, what's a quote, healthy relationship with food. And I kind of hold folks' feet to the fire that if you come in talking about this idea that you need a healthy relationship with food, I think that we have tons of other issues in other areas, and we need to address those first. And again, it usually relates back to love or connectivity or power or something like that. And the food becomes kind of the focus and the leverage instead of really addressing the root issue.
I like that. I really like that, because it's essentially kind of what you had told me before, where for you, it's just not worth eating gluten. But at the same time, it's, I think, pretty far away from the approach of someone like Tim Ferriss, who said, in the 4-Hour Body, you have to have a cheat day because it's going to put you back on track and make you feel so crappy that the rest of the week you're not even going to think about cheat foods.
Yeah. I think that was a recommendation that was made more in theory than based off of some clinical observation of success. It kind of sounds good, but yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I love Tim's work, and sometimes it's absolutely. Like, it's exactly what people need to hear because it's pragmatic. Like, eating, quote, I believe it was a proper blank ton of eggs was the recommended prescription.
Right.
Amazing. So, Rob, I do want to ask, because keto and fasting have become so common among kind of our contemporaries. And I know a number of our kind of mutual friends have written entire books on the topics of keto, entire books on the topic of intermittent fasting. Did you get a chance to cover some of that stuff in the book? And I'd love to hear, just because I take your opinion as the gold standard, I'd love to hear how it shakes down for you.
We need to raise your standards then. I should be more at the janitorial level than executive level, but thank you. Yet I did include a chapter on ketosis and fasting. It's very last chapter, and I think the title is Hammers, Drills, and Ketosis, the one tool your doctor is unlikely to ever use, or something to that effect. And again, I use this analogy of like saws and hammers and drills. And, in circumstances where you've got engineers or contractors, there's usually not a ton of debate around what tool you should use for a specific job. People may argue, well, I would build this ramp like this or that like that. But then when it comes time to build that ramp, like you use a hammer in the appropriate place for a hammer, a saw in the appropriate place for a saw. But in this nutrition realm, it just becomes this all or nothing, black and white. It's either all low carb or all low fat. And it's just kind of ridiculous. There's no nuance that is reserved for various situations. And ketosis and fasting have a really long history of success within medical circles. There's great evolutionary biology that, suggests the power of periods of fasting, particularly when an individual is sick or injured. There's some really powerful restorative elements to that. But people just don't understand the appropriate time and place and utilization. And so I go through and I really, on the one hand, sing the praises of how incredible ketosis and fasting can be for folks. But then I also point out that, most of the people who are willing to do ketosis and fasting, they're also the folks that will do like 10 CrossFit workouts a week. They haven't eaten 6 grams of carbs in 7 months, and then they intermittent fast 18 hours out of the day. So the people who are actually willing or likely to do intermittent fasting are exactly the people who probably shouldn't, because they are already wound tight. Their allostatic load, like the total stress load they have on their system, is already monumental, and they really don't need more. They're already exercising. They're already eating a pretty solid diet. And so they're, depending on how much of that intermittent fasting they're dropping in, it may be beneficial, or it may be digging an even deeper hole that they're going to need to try to get themselves out of, relative to like a really laid back kind of type B, like computer programmer that's sedentary and they get a little activity but not a ton. That person may be fantastic for intermittent fasting and also ketosis. So it's just really important to understand, the utility of the tool again. We wouldn't have huge freakouts about, do I use a drill or a handsaw for something? It's going to be pretty obvious which one is going to produce the superior results for a particular outcome that we're looking for.
It's a really, really strong metaphor, I have to say. And I really like this idea of taking each of these different elements as a little bit of a tool in the toolkit, and essentially kind of like designing your own, not just diet in the sense of variety of foods, but your own regimen as well. And I think, to be honest with you, like, just given how much knowledge I have from talking with you and reading your books and interviewing so many other folks like Dr. Cordain and so on and so forth, I have all this knowledge, and I think what's been lacking is the practical framework to apply it. So I'm really, really excited about the book.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, that definitely is a big goal, just trying to provide some context for, well, when do you do higher carb versus lower carb? Like, how can you objectively and subjectively assess that and make those changes as needed? And that's maybe another important point too, is, folks will start oftentimes in one place, like maybe insulin resistant and not super carb tolerant, but that may change dramatically a few months down the road with some improved sleep and exercise. And then we need to change gears to keep pace with what the body really needs.
Right. And so this is very much a kind of teach a man to fish play, where people can make those determinations for themselves. I love it. I can't wait to read the book. And we like to assign homework in every episode. So I'm going to assign the homework for everybody if they can, if they have the time and the budget. It's not an expensive book, but pick up a copy, you guys, of Wired to Eat. I have it in my hand right now, and I'm super excited to read it. But I did want to ask you, Rob, what's some other homework that you would like to assign to the audience? Maybe a little bit of an experiment that they could try out while they're waiting for their copy to arrive in the mail.
Oh, man, I just can't hump folks' knees sufficiently to improve their sleep. And so, the basic sleep hacks of, dimming the lights in the evening, getting a pair of blue blockers, installing some sort of a software on either your tablet or laptop or phone that, minimizes the blue wavelengths of light in the evening. Just really make sleep a priority, because regardless of what we're trying to do, whether it's improve insulin sensitivity or, a lot of the challenge that folks have, they just reach a point of decision fatigue by the end of the day. They just have to make decision. And if we are sleep deprived, we start off already with our decision fatigue, or our decision bucket, like almost empty. And what happens in those cases is that when you're then faced with that choice of, oh man, do I eat the chocolate cake and have a bunch of booze, or do I make some better options? You go for the poorer option because you are just maxed out on decision making. So, if I could encourage folks to do anything, it's look into sleep hygiene, look at strategies for improving your sleep. And that has got to be the greatest return on investment of anything that you could do, like diet, exercise, what have you. The best return you're going to get is improving your sleep.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I know you and I have both interviewed Doc Parsley about sleep on each of our respective shows. We also had an episode, if the audience wants to check out, with Nick Littlehills, who goes into like the bedding, the pillows, the temperature, like all this nitty gritty stuff. I don't know if you know Nick, but super interesting guy. I mean, that was our most expensive episode by far, because after hearing it, I invested ungodly sums of money in like electric blinds that completely black out the room, new mattress, new bed, bunch of new sets of sheets, you know, like the whole deal. But the results don't lie. I mean, I sleep like a baby now. Right.
Yeah. Totally believe that. Yeah.
So awesome. That's fantastic homework for everyone to investigate in. Couple rapid fire questions for you, Rob. One, what are some products or resources that you could not do your job without?
Oh, man, that's a really good question. I mean, so I've been using Trello more recently as a kind of a project management platform. We were using Asana and I really like it, but Asana is it can do a lot of things and almost to the point where you get a little bit overwhelmed with it. Whereas Trello is a little more streamlined, and I've found that to be really, really helpful in project management. And then in the process of writing this book, I used a platform called Scrivener, which the only downside to it that I see right now is it is not cloud enabled so that I can, collaborate in real time with folks with the platform. But it has some amazing features for outlining a project, putting all of your citations in one spot. And it has a really cool little dopamine hit gadget where you can set a daily word goal for the amount of writing that you do.
Oh, cool.
And the thing will start off a really angry red, and then it shifts to orange, and then yellow, and then it shifts to green, and then you get a ding. And I can't tell you how it sounds ridiculous, but I really can't tell you how many times in the process of writing this book, I would just be totally smoked. And then I'd look at that box. I'm like, oh, man, if I do another 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to get my ding, and I would do it. And I'd get that ding and I'm like, oh, I'll go 5 more minutes, and I'd do a little bit more work.
Oh,
and
I love it.
Yeah, that goal and task completion is really powerful. So Trello and Scrivener,
that's solid.
I would definitely recommend that folks check out. Yeah,
that's solid. I've heard Tim talk about Scrivener, but I've never tried it. But I committed today to writing like a bunch of new content. So I think I need to download this thing and try it out.
It's really cool. And again, the only thing that I would ding it is the lack of cloud-enabled stuff. And so there is another thing called Ulysses, which is cloud-enabled. And if the stuff is more kind of like blog post length material, Ulysses might be a better option. Scrivener is definitely a better option from the organizational standpoint for bigger projects like a book or like some computer programming or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I'm going to check it out because, like I said,
cool.
Big project coming up. Rob, I wanted to ask, and I'm going to try and make this a quick question, but what do you think the next book is going to be about? Do you have any idea?
Oh, man. I'm actually playing around with some stuff with Diana Rogers. She's a fantastic RD and super sharp. She also owns a permaculture farm in Massachusetts. And the next book is tentatively titled Kale versus Cow, and it's really looking at the sustainability considerations and the morality of animal consumption and the role that animal husbandry could have in a sustainable planet and sustainable future. And so that one will probably sell about 3 copies, but it's kind of one of those things that just needs to be done.
Yep.
But I'm always passionate about the health, but I've been talking about protein, carbs, fat for almost 20 years, and there's always something to learn. There's always a cool nuance, but I'm really at this spot where, for me, I'm kind of, standing up and looking around and saying, okay, what's my legacy? And helping people on their health is amazing. But, thinking about the planet, the environment, or, I have kids, what's it going to be like for them? What's it going to be like for my grandkids? And trying to figure out some strategies for the economy, the environment, all these things to be more decentralized and robust. And that's the stuff that I'm really, really interested in. So Kale versus Cow is going to be the next one. And I'm chipping away at that a little bit. I'm getting a little bit of, progress done on that.
Amazing. So, all right. I feel like I might be able to get my foot in the door for you to come back in another 6 months.
If you are foolish enough to bring down property values again, I will absolutely do it. I'm always happy to do that. You're an amazing interviewer, so that would be a huge honor.
Very kindly, sir. Awesome. I'm putting it on our editorial calendar right now. Mr. Robb Wolf, before we kind of let you go, 2 last questions. One, we're obviously going to link everybody to Wired to Eat, Paleo Solution Podcast in the blog post, but where are any other places you'd like us to send them? I do recommend, kind of as a plug for you, I love your Facebook posts. And I know you've got a huge following on there. You're very active on Facebook. And I highly recommend anyone out there who's kind of feeling your vibe to follow you on Facebook. But anywhere else you'd like us to send folks?
Yeah, just robbwolf.com will have links to most everything that I'm doing. If folks want to download some cool freebies, we have like a 30-day reset and a bunch of really fun kind of support material that you can get by signing up on the newsletter at Robb Wolf for Twitter, at Das Robb Wolf on Instagram. And then there's 2 Facebook entities, robbwolf.com online, which is my purely nutrition and health related material. And then there's my private page where you'll see some occasional political posts and economics and stuff like that. So if you're thin skinned or allergic to the concept of economics, I would not check out my personal page at all. It will give you a rash instantly. So yeah.
Totally fair. Totally fair. Rob, last question I want to ask you is, if people take away really just one major big message here, what would you hope for that to be?
Oh man, the major message is it's not your fault.
Ooh.
That's it. This current situation you're in, if you find change challenging, if you think that, it's the difficulty of changing your diet, changing your exercise or lifestyle, if you think that that's some sort of a personal failure, you are completely wrong. This is the way that we are designed. It's how we're wired to eat. It's how we're wired to live. Now, once we understand that, it should be liberating, but it should also face us with a choice, like, what are we going to do now? But if there was one thing to take away and really remind yourself, it is not your fault. This is all totally normal. We just have to figure out a different strategy for dealing with it.
Fantastic note to end on. Rob, always a pleasure chatting with you, my friend. So cool to see what you're working on.
So tickled for your continued love and support on what I'm up to. So thank you.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. Well, let's talk soon, and good luck with the book launch. I know by the time this episode comes out, it will already be in stores and already on Amazon. So guys, make sure to check out Wired to Eat.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take care, Rob.
Bye-bye.
All right, super friends, that's it for this week's episode. We hope you really enjoyed it and learned a ton of applicable stuff that can help you go out there and overcome the impossible. If so, please do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or however you found this podcast. In addition to that, we are always looking for great guest posts on the blog or awesome guests right here on the podcast. So if you know somebody, or you are somebody, or you have thought of somebody who would be a great fit for the show or for our blog, please reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. Our email is info@becomingasuperhuman.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.